So hope you all enjoyed your coffee, that you took a few minutes of break. It's time to start with the next session to give the appropriate time to our next presenters. So this session is going to be chaired by Professor Roberto Caranta, and we're continuing dealing with issues in the sustainable public procurement. The floor is all yours, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Leila. It's again, as a chairperson, I thank you once more in a different capacity for organizing this. I hope that most of us are back, because we are going to have a very interesting presentation by my colleague and good friend, Professor Olga Martin Ortega from Greenwich. You have the floor without any much ado, please.
Thank you very much, Roberto. To continue with my disastrous technological addresses this morning, I lost my PowerPoint. So I can't share my own slides now with you. But of course, I've got my presentation ready and written, so you would again have to look at my face more than you probably would have wanted to this morning. But I will keep to the time, but also, try to convey everything that, all the little data that I had in my presentation. But generally, I don't think there will be a problem with me just not needing to share PowerPoint. So the title of my presentation today is Driving Transparency in Public Supply Chains through Sustainable Public Procurement, and I'll be specifically looking at the response of the public sector in the UK to the Modern Slavery Act. So why have I chosen to look at transparency in supply chains? And because I've been working for a long time in human rights in supply chains. So as we know, the way the global trade and global production and consumption is organized is very much through a complex supply chain, that they are complex and obscure by nature. And they are so because this allows companies to minimize costs and maximize benefits. But in the process, human rights are being violated, workers' rights are being flagrantly ignored, and we have important environmental consequences as well. So one of the main approaches to human rights in supply chain generally is transparency in supply chain. So the private sector in particular, be transparent, report and disclose their efforts to control the supply chain in a way that it's starting to guarantee some kind of accountability and also monitoring from third parties of the human rights conditions in such chains. But public supply chains are the same as private supply chains. We are public buyers, we're consumers. The last element of the supply chain is the public buyer. When we go through public purchase, we purchase through public procurement. Therefore, what does this mean? It means public buyers should, or at least should consider having the same level of responsibilities that we're demanding of companies. And this is just a basic element of public policy coherence, but also is being now recognized not only through the Sustainable Development Goals, as Roberto said very well, and Sustainable Development Goal 12, Target 7, but also other goals, including Sustainable Development 8, in the elimination of exploitation through supply chains. So this is why I want to study the confluence between the transparency in supply chains demand and sustainable public procurement, because they both bring me to this state obligation to protect human rights. States have an obligation to protect human rights in all their functions, including when they develop public procurement, because they develop public procurement as part of their public functions. And this is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are very clear when they establish that states have a duty to protect human rights in all settings, including promoting human rights through their public procurement. So in this confluence, I find the Modern Slavery Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act. And this is very interesting because the UK Modern Slavery Act, which was passed in 2015, was not originally intended to address public buyers. In fact, the UK Modern Slavery Act really is a very wide act that deals with many aspects of combating and preventing modern slavery. It just has one specific clause, which is this clause, section 54, which is devoted to transparency in supply chain. So it's a very broad act, but it's the transparency in supply chain section, section 54, the one that I'm interested in. So in principle, what this section establishes is that all commercial entities need to publish an annual statement where they will disclose publicly what are the efforts they are developing to combat modern slavery and human trafficking in their supply chain. So in principle, the wording of the act is clear: commercial entities. And then the state established, the government established a threshold: commercial entities that go above £36 million turnover annually. So this obligation starts for commercial entities in 2015. So the first financial year they have to report on is 2015, 2016. And so the first reports are coming out in 2016. Catches one specific type of public entity, which is universities in the UK, higher education institutions. So this is a debate, and Alberto has also written about this: to what extent can we consider universities in the UK public bodies? Well, universities, on the one hand, are caught by the Public Contract Acts, the Public Contracts Regulations, which is the transposition of the EU 2014 directive. And so in principle, they are public procurement entities. On the other hand, universities, a very high, a significant portion of their income is private income because it's through tuition. Also, universities is commercial, certain commercial activities they engage in, or the contracts they engage in private commercial activities. Therefore, they're kind of hybrid. They have to follow public procurement regulation, and on the other hand, they're considered commercial entities. And universities in the UK have a very high annual turnover. So most of them is about 170 higher education institutions. Most of them actually fall within the obligation to report under the UK Modern Slavery Act. There's another large group of public entities that are reporting under the UK Modern Slavery Act, which are local authorities. Local authorities are absolutely not within the scope of the law because local authorities are not private entities, are not commercial entities, but local authorities have chosen voluntarily to report, many of them. So this has been my research in the past 5 years, when the first reports started to come out in 2016 until the reports in 2020. So we've analyzed, with the help of some wonderful students, and my students come to me to study international law, and they find themselves doing scrutinizing public procurement practices, which is a bit of a shock at the beginning for them. But I have to say I've managed to infuse a couple of international human rights lawyers into public procurement, which is always I think is one of my biggest achievements. Anyway, so that's what I've been looking at. I've been looking at really how the impact of this obligation to report has had on the public sector in the UK. And I'll give you a bit more details regarding the reporting practices itself, but I think the impact has been significant. I think we've seen in only 5 years a real awareness over the role of the public buyer with regards to human rights in their supply chains. I think we're seeing a shift in this perception and in this kind of practices, and especially the government, the UK government, Home Office. This is the Modern Slavery Prevention Unit in the Home Office. I hope, I'm not sure if this has been recorded, but I normally don't praise our current government, nor did I the previous one in the UK, but I do have to praise people working at the Modern Slavery Prevention Unit at the UK Home Office, because they've definitely made a tectonic change in the way the public sector addresses their obligations with regard to exploitation in supply chains. So therefore, this is not only exploitation of workers that are directly employed or employed through agencies or direct or subcontracted with one level of subcontracting, for example, to develop government functions. This is as well in the supply chain in the lower tiers. So supplier of suppliers until we get to factory level, component manufacturing, and farm level, etc. So this tectonic change we can see in that the UK government now has produced a statement on modern slavery and human trafficking. The quality of this statement, we can debate later on, but and the UK has driven the international commitment of the so-called 5 Eyes, which is a very creepy name, which is the countries Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US and the UK collaboration. They've made a public commitment that they will include public procurement within their efforts to combat modern slavery, and that states should pass guidance and regulation with regards to their own practices to address modern slavery in procurement. So there has been a real significant shift. Other organizations are voluntarily reporting. We have museums, galleries, Transport for London, which is huge public procurement. It's a huge buyer. It's one of the biggest buyers in the UK as well. They are all voluntarily reporting on their practices to prevent, identify, prevent, and mitigate modern slavery in their supply chain. So what have we learned specifically of the reporting by universities in these 5 years and public buyers in these 5 years? As I said, in the past 5 years, we've studied all the reports that we've been able to find from universities and most of them from local authorities as well. So what conclusions can we get of this very minutious research on what these organizations have disclosed? Let's think as well that this is what these organizations are reporting they're doing, reporting their intent to do. So as very well Anna said before, we haven't been able to actually assess whether these policies, practices, strategies, and actions that these institutions say they're doing actually have had a meaningful impact on the ground. And this, imagine if this is difficult, like from a socially, from a community perspective, how many employed have you had in your community, how many long-term unemployed, how many women, how many disabled workers, etc. It's nearly impossible to measure the impact on the ground in, say, the textile industry, the textile sector in Bangladesh, or the fishing, seafood fishing sector in Thailand, for example. But we're trying to find ways to measure this, especially as Roberto knows as well, very advanced in the research on the electronics industry and the impact on the electronics industry, for example. Anyway, what have we learned of the studying the reports of these institutions? First, institutions did not really have much clue of what their own supply chain was. Institutions definitely had not done any exercise to try to understand their own supply chains and try to understand who is in the supply chain, who's at risk, and why, and how their own purchasing practices actually affect or actually maximize or increase the risk. So purchasing practices, and this is something that is very important that I think we should very much debate within the context of sustainable procurement, to what extent these practices of low cost, faster turnaround and slow payment actually crystallize and perpetuate this situation of exploitation down the supply chain. So our own public purchasing practice are very important. So organizations did not have an idea of how this affected the supply chain. They didn't even know what the supply chain was. Very lack of understanding of how to develop this due diligence in terms of assessing and identifying the risks, and very a deficient understanding of whose risk this is. It's mostly institutions have been thinking, is this my reputational risk, for example? No, it's like, oh, if they catch us with labor in our uniforms, is going to be terrible for us. Well, it's not your risk that we're looking at; it's the risk of people. There was some years ago an important report that made a really big impact here, which by the civil society organization Watch, that's called Servants of Servers, in which it pointed out how UK universities live very much on the fee of Chinese students, and the servers that we are buying are actually made by forced labor of Chinese students in China. So we're profiting from Chinese students two ways. So that's the main conclusion. The second conclusion is, the practices have evolved and there's a much more awareness, but still remains very much at the policy level. Organizations are developing policy or talking about it. There is very few organizations actually measuring the impact of their own activities, and I've already pointed at this. Some of the collaborations I think a very important point is this issue of collaboration, which I'll go into a bit more of collaboration within the sector and collaboration with external actors, but the engagement with the supplier is very important. At the very beginning of the reports, the engagement with the supplier was limited to pre-qualification questionnaires, to asking the supplier for assurances of do you comply with your obligations under the Modern Slavery Act? Well, this is not enough. So obviously, suppliers in all the pre-qualification questionnaires, everybody was saying, yeah, I have zero tolerance to modern slavery. Obviously, we all do. So engagement with suppliers has changed over time, and some tools have been used. We can talk about specific tools in the Q&A if you like, but there's a much better understanding now. What is the key role of the engagement with the supplier, not just to in the contract management phase, not just to understand quality, time, leads, etc., but also the shared responsibility towards the supply chain and human rights in the supply chain. And picking up on this idea of engagement with the supplier, I think as well, very open statements as we will absolutely terminate a relationship with our supplier if we find modern slavery, have also been tamed down, which is very important, because not terminating a relationship with a supplier because there is modern slavery or risk of modern slavery in the supply chain is not the immediate right course of action, because we lose our leverage as public buyers into what we can do to the situation. Again, we can talk later about this. So just one more point regarding our analysis, and I'll conclude. So our analysis as well looked at collaboration, the way the public buyers collaborate within the sector and with external agents. So within the sector is very interesting. The public procurement consortia has actually really kind of stepped up the mark here, and there's a lot of sector collaboration. The local government association in the UK as well is also doing good work in this. But the most interesting one is the collaboration with civil society, for example. And in this, we've been very lucky in the UK that we've had a really strong presence of some civil society organizations who do monitoring, who do a support of companies that have been for a long time doing support of companies, and now they support the public sector. And we have the wonderful very effective example of electronics watch, of which I know the Generalitat and the government, the local government of Catalonia is part of as well. The Act also asks people to report on trainings. This has created a massive cottage industry of consultants providing trainings on modern slavery. So now we have the whole country's expert on what you should do in your modern slavery statement, and some of them earning a lot of money with that. Says the academic, who doesn't earn any money, obviously. No bitterness. So just to conclude then, so what have we learned in this process? As I said, we've definitely have pushed through the agenda. I think this is very important. We are frustrated with the slowness of the development, but to be honest, we've had 20, 30 years of corporate social responsibility, and we haven't seen the advances that we've seen in 5 years in the public sector. So I think the public sector is showing a level of leadership. I am very concerned with COVID, because I'm very concerned with the lack of resources and the needs for prioritization. I'm very concerned that this will fall off the agenda just because people don't have capacity and don't have resources. And I think we need to keep on pressing that sustainable public procurement cannot fall off the agenda, because sustainable public procurement is what would help us recover better, doing things better. Public procurement needs to be at the center of this. So that is a strong worry. And so we'll see next year's, if this is reflected in next year's statements or not. And I think I just remain at your disposal for questions and further discussion at this point.
Thank you very much, Olga. That was a very, very interesting presentation for us all. As it was indicated before, we will just have questions through the chat. I will take one, maximum 2 questions now for Olga, and then at the end of all speakers. I have already one by Jake Smith. Does what you say also apply to net zero and carbon emission reporting transparency?
Interesting, because there's been in the UK traditionally there's been this it's called the Sustainable Flexible Framework, which is a framework that is a voluntary framework in which institutions would actually self-assess themselves at the level of compliance with sustainable procurement goals. However, this was very, very focused on environmental elements, and it's still happening. This is why universities and local authorities have been able to react so quickly, I think, to the needs of human rights and supply chains transformations of procurement practices, because they had a very strong green public procurement practices and strategies and KPIs. So my research has only focused on the practices with regards to modern slavery and human trafficking, because that's the information that they're compelled to disclose through the Modern Slavery Act. But yeah, there is important reporting on and self-assessment on carbon emissions.
Okay, just one more question from Deirdre Halloran. Does the UK's public sector duty have any role in this? Deirdre is from Galway in Ireland, and she will be one of our next speakers.
Yeah, I think when you mean public sector, does the UK public sector duty have any role in it? Duty, I'm not very sure public sector duty what it means. Does the public sector have a duty, like a specific legal duty on this? Well, the government has actually publish a PPN, which is public procurement notice, in which it actually demanded or made it compulsory for organizations to look at modern slavery in their supply chain and actually refer them to a guidance. So we have a UK guidance on how to do this in the public sector. So they do have a duty which is through PPN, as I said, but it's nowhere in law that says the public sector needs to prevent modern slavery in the supply chain.
Thank you very much, Olga. I will now invite, let's say, to the rooster, as in the old times, Angélica Gómez from the Education para la Sustentabilidad of the Education Ministry in Argentina, Buenos Aires. Welcome and thank you for joining us at what must be quite an early time. Oh no, there is already some sunshine in Buenos Aires. Oh, well, it's summer there. Yeah, also it is summer. Welcome, Angélica. We really very much look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Roberto, to all of you for this warm welcome and invitation to be part of Incorporate Sustainable Conference. It is very early in Argentina. We are still in winter. Sun is just rising. And my mother tongue is not English, so I have my notes. Please forgive my English and let me know if I need to be more clear with some things during the next minutes. So, actually, as you said, I'm the head of education for sustainability at the Ministry of Education of the government of the City of Buenos Aires. I have a presentation. Just let me show it. Do you see the screen? Just yes, no, it's okay. Yes, thank you, Anna. Jake, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. I will present you about our experience in public service and about our aim to build a more sustainable, equal, fair, and diverse world. This conference finds us in an extraordinary moment. In the middle of a sanitarian crisis, and in Argentina, having had the longest confinement, we are about 180 days already. We think the development model we live in is causing critical situations in environmental, social, and cultural terms, and a change of paradigm is necessary since it's not possible to continue using the limited natural resources as we do. A collective and an individual change, right? That's why it's so important to create consciousness and awareness and remake that government's role is central in respecting and preserving the natural resources of planet Earth and achieving a sustainable development of the cities. Because of that, each one has a key role, and a public servant also has a key role. The Ministry of Education of the City of Buenos Aires has the aim of designing, implementing, and assessing public policies that empower people so they become active members in the process of the sustainable development of the city. Buenos Aires has 3 million inhabitants, which represents a big challenge for achieving a more urban, sustainable development and creating a more inclusive, accessible, and resilient society. Facing this challenge, Buenos Aires, since 2016, adheres to the 2030 Agenda and its help with the Sustainable Development Goals via several strategic plans. Reaching SDGs requires to have government's decisive role when it comes to I'm sorry, it's changing the slide. Oh, okay. So I was saying that reaching SDGs requires to have government's role, decisive role when it comes to public policies, implementation that allows a joint progress socially, economically, and environmentally speaking. So in this new world, take on sustainability as a central concept of the city's management implies adjusting to a new public administration system with a new view of the prices, the practices and processes in an institutional and ruling framework. In the Ministry of Education, I'm in charge of the management of 3 different programs whose main perspective is education for sustainability. The Green Schools program to promote...
We are a bit losing you.
Okay. Let's try. I'm sorry. Maybe the connection. Are you hearing me okay?
No, now is it okay? Yes,
Okay.
now yes, but we lost the slides.
You lost the slide? Okay, Jake, thank you. You can hear and see the slide. Maybe okay, Dirk, I continue then. Just
yes, brilliant. With the
okay.
kids.
The Green Schools program I was telling you about is to promote sustainability through education and environmental management in public and private schools, actually reaching more than 2,000 schools. I also like to tell you that this year Green Schools program celebrates 10 years, set as a public constant policy. 4 years ago, we created the Sustainable Ministry program, born looking for institutional and cultural transformation and to make a shift to more friendly environmental practices and processes within our own ministry. In 2018, we started the 3rd program, Global Citizenship. It's a program that links education for sustainable development to digital education with focus on SDGs and 2030 agenda. Within this program, Sustainable Ministry, we started asking ourselves about our role in and wondering if what we promoted in schools was the same as what we were promoted in-house. Do we separate our waste at source, recycle? How do we acquire goods and services? So in order to promote a new environmental culture among employees of the ministry, we divided the program in 4 big themes. Environmental management, that aims to modify the organizational processes that take place in the buildings of the ministry. Organizational culture, that aims to offer training spaces and awareness in people for creating new and environmental friendly habits. Sustainable procurement, access to and help the different areas of the ministry in the work of acquiring sustainable criteria in documents referred to recruitments and purchases. And for infrastructure, trains and makes recommendations applying the environmental criteria in the design and construction of new buildings or modification in old ones. So how am I doing so far? It's okay. Well, today I would like to tell you about the specific work done in our hub of activity, sustainable procuring. So the state is usually the main national economy's goods and services consumer. Therefore, its power of purchasing represents a big opportunity to change the consumption and production patterns towards sustainable models. So our actions are articulated in this regard with SDGs and number 12, you said it already, production and responsible consumption in the goal 12 point target 7 specifically. It promotes public acquisition practices that are sustainable according to national policy and priorities. So next. So through SPP, we promote the incorporation of sustainability criteria in the public procurement. generating benefits for the society, the economy, and the environment. This environmental central point aims to hire goods and services that generate the least environmental impact possible in its life cycle with the same efficiency that they would obtain with the hiring of a good or non-sustainable service. This main point promotes the reduction of social inequality, promotes transparency, respect for the diversity and participation of all actors. And the economic main concept will look for getting the best balance between quality and price with the incorporation of conditions that warranty a fair and non-discriminatory recruiting progress, a higher value to the money in the whole life cycle, and an appropriate financial management process. So following, I wanted to show you some of the results obtained until now for the core concept mentioned. Happily, I can tell you since the beginning of the program, we have recovered 30 tons of recyclable material. We've managed to move all furniture from 600 schools, and we advise in more than 10 public sustainable procurement documents. We've changed lights into LED technology in 84 school buildings. We're still doing on them. We have around 700 buildings, school buildings in Buenos Aires, and we've installed solar system panels, photovoltaic systems in 7 schools, among other projects. Also manage around 130 tons of electronic waste. That was a really amazing project. Following images show some of our work in SPP mentioned, like plastic wood furniture within the ministry, the main building of the ministry, intervention in documents for sustainable packaging in network for students, incorporation on compost bins, and hydroponic vegetable gardens, solar system panels installation, and change of LED lights. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that before the very complex environmental challenges we are currently facing, the public sector has the opportunity of elaborating policies in order to create a more responsible management, aligned with the protection of the environment for a more sustainable future. For that, it's necessary to create new values and abilities as public servants to allow to adopt a sustainable perspective in the process of making decisions regarding the public acquisition of goods and services. So, to finish, let me add that we usually hear the phrase, children are the future. We usually hear it in education areas also, but yes, they are, but also the future is today. And we as responsible adults who make the decisions are the ones who must transform ourselves to build a more sustainable, equal, and peaceful world. So thank you very much for your attention, and you can contact us to learn more about our work.
So I guess Roberto is not present. Is there a problem in the connection? Or let me see.
I think he's mute, right?
Roberto, are you with us?
Yes, my fault. Thank you very much, Angélica, and thank you very much for your presentation. You should have not worried about language skills. It was really very clear. Abusing my role as a chairperson, I would just ask whether, because I've in Barrio 31st, and I know, can you hear me? And a former student of mine, Sebastian Quintana, from the American Development Bank, told me they are having actions specifically for Barrio 31. So my question would be whether they were involved too, and how is the approach that the Multilateral Development Bank have to sustainable procurement from your experience? Nice talk.
Well, we have a great with the bank with a big hydraulic plan for the city. We've been working with them, and we are in Barrio 31. The Ministry of Education just moved in to Barrio 31. For those who doesn't know, the Barrio 31, it's a very I don't know how to say villa or just poor neighborhood.
It's a kind of poor neighborhood.
Yes, like a favela for Brazil.
Yes.
Or okay, so the plans for the city were just to include and integrate the barrio to the city, right? We all want a sustainable development for the city, and with inclusion for all. So the first thing was to move the entire Ministry of Education to that neighborhood, and just started to work with the people living there and start an integration. So within this program of sustainable ministry, we are working with the neighbors to integrate in this process of management of waste, of some learning courses, and other projects also.
Thank you very much. And if there is any urgent question to Angélica, otherwise you will be able to ask more questions to our speakers at the end. Any urgent question? Last call for urgent questions. Okay, thank you again very much, Angélica, for this.
Thank you, Roberto.
And keeping the conversation. Now speaking is Deirdre Halloran from University of Galway, and she will be talking about social clauses in Ireland. You are welcome, and you have the floor, please, Deirdre.
Hi, Roberto. Good to see you. Good to see everyone today. And thank you, Leila, very much for allowing me to speak here. It's very much my pleasure to be able to join this conversation and to have to be part of a conversation which so many of these people I am relying on heavily in my own work. So I'm going to try and share my presentation. Let's see how this goes. Is that working? Yeah?
Yes, perfect.
Very good. Okay. So, so yeah, the title of my presentation, my paper today is about social clauses in Ireland. It is quite an Irish-focused paper. I hope you will forgive me, but we're in a situation where we're desperately trying to catch up with the rest of Europe, and this is my own research into this, into our particular reality. So first of all, I'm going to look at Ireland's relationship to sustainable procurement and looking as to why we do have a different perspective and a different relationship with it. I'm then going to look at a particular research project that I'm working on right now, and that is looking at Irish social clauses that have been included in public procurement contracts since 2014 till today. There was a selected amount of projects that the research is looking at, and the idea of the research was to just try to look at what the barriers and drivers are for including social clauses into Irish public procurement contracts, and then I'll finish up with with some of the recommendations that have arisen from the research so far. Okay, so so Ireland, as we know, in the rest of Europe, the use of public procurement to further sustainable considerations has become quite well established, but this is in stark contrast to the situation in Ireland, where it has actually been very recently since social considerations have been, or any considerations have been, any sustainable considerations have been a part of policy. And so the first question I decided to look at is just to see why is this so? And the idea is looking at why Ireland is different is to hopefully help clarify how we can be better at in the future for including it. And so again, I guess I should probably say from the start that my particular stance in this area is not sort of questioning the good of this. I'm coming from the perspective that it is a good, that it should be done, and that's the stance as I progress. So there isn't I'm not sort of looking into whether or not Ireland should do it. I'm saying Ireland should, and I can argue about the reasons why another day. But for now, I'm looking at why in the past we didn't have any sustainable procurement policy. And so, the first thing is that Ireland has a very unique political and economic development into becoming a nation state, in contrast to the UK and the majority of countries in Europe. Ireland did not develop a Keynesian welfare state, lacking the resources of longer established states. It depended on voluntary provisions in key policy domains such as education and health. And then, paired with that, as throughout the 20th century, Ireland did not elect a social democratic or any left-leaning type government. Since Ireland gained its independence in 1922, oh, that's my Alexa is actually talking to me. Sorry. Sorry. So, sorry. Sorry about that. My Alexa was listening to my voice and was trying to answer a question. So that was anyway. So sorry about that. So to continue, I'm saying that Ireland doesn't have any history of a left-leaning. Exactly, Alexa may have some answers that I don't have. Didn't elect a social democratic, and we have this history of having kind of centrist parties ruling us, and these were formed out of our own Irish Civil War policies, and so our political development wasn't from a left or right wing cleavage. It was actually from this pro-treaty or anti-treaty cleavage, and that has dominated our politics until relatively recently. So as a result, when we did start to develop the idea of sort of becoming a part of Europe, we dived straight into the idea that we were going to become a competitive state, and indeed the Irish economic model was kind of lauded for a very small period of time, but it was seen as being a beacon of what a good deep liberalization state could achieve. We embraced deregulation, we had entrepreneurial freedoms, we had embraced free market principles, but along with that, we had a very conservative attitude towards procurement, and certainly there was absolutely no room in there for any idea of a sustainable procurement. And so then the financial crisis happened in 2008, and along with many countries in Europe, again, sustainable procurement was looked on as a possible tool for helping countries. And Ireland, we changed too. We had to change. There was deep change that happened in Ireland after 2008, and part of this was our procurement, our setup. We had a very decentralized procurement setup prior to that, and then the decision was made to make it centralized in 2013. The OGP was created, in which we centralized all our procurement activity. And within 6 months of that, there was a social procurement group set up within the Irish government. And from that point, we have looked towards this area as a possible social tool. So, next slide. Okay, that didn't go very well. But anyway, so our policy framework, our national policy framework, is probably the same as most other European countries at this point, but our social, that should say social procurement framework, it's pretty sparse. We have 2 papers. We have one that was released in 2018, and it was released called Incorporating Social Considerations into Public Procurement. And that was really the first time that Ireland actually said, yes, you can do this. Now, it doesn't in any way encourage people to do it, but it just says, yes, we agree that it is allowed, and it reiterates how one can do it, and the legislation, the framework under which one can do it. Then the second circular that was released in 2019, it was said promoting the use of environmental and social considerations, and that was really more directed towards our climate action plan of 2019, and it was more directed towards incorporating green considerations. And they took a stronger stance, and they did. There was the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and they instructed departments to consider green criteria. Again, when it comes to social considerations, they say it is allowed, but they step back from actually in any way encouraging departments or local authorities to do it. So part of this reticence is our value for money, the central commitment we have to our definition of value for money. And well, Ireland doesn't actually have one definition of value for money. There is a number of policy documents. There's actually 22 different policy documents that mention value for money, and each kind of refer to each other as regards what value for money stands for. But if you kind of mesh them all together, it's the idea is that it's concerned with being efficient, and it's concerned with being effective. When it comes to social considerations, you can see there up in the slide how value for money is not about securing the lowest initial price. However, there's the worrying last part of our definition is that Ireland's procurement policy focus is the delivery of public services in a sustainable manner by ensuring value for money and access to public procurement opportunities for businesses. And I think that isn't quite the definition of sustainable that we're using here in this conference about, sustainable, about connecting to the 3 pillars of, environment and social and economic. It seems to be more about being sustainable just in a purely economic way. And so that is something that is an issue within Ireland and its attitude towards sustainable procurement. So I'm going to move now to the research project that I'm involved in. It's funded by IREC, and it is concerned about looking at the use of social clauses in a selected number of procurements, and semi-structured interviews took place with various stakeholders from within the contracting authorities, with contractors and with outside agencies. And the objectives was to identify the drivers and barriers in order to hopefully be able to provide some learnings for some policy guidance from this point onwards. So, okay, so there's three different contracting authorities. The first is Dublin City Council, and there was two projects. They were kind of, there were two separate contracts that had a connection. They were both regeneration projects. They were housing estates, Dolphin's Barn and St. Teresa's Gardens. They're in a very socially and economically deprived area of inner city Dublin, and it was decided in the 90s, because of this and because of the deterioration of the flats in which people were living, it was decided by Dublin City Council that they were chosen to be regenerated, and they were doing it by a PPP. And unfortunately, and there was great excitement about that, and there was great fanfare around it. And unfortunately, 2008, the crash, and the contractors that had been involved in those PPP projects, the private developers that were involved in the contracts, they pulled out, and these regeneration projects, they collapsed. And this there was huge disappointment, obviously, within the communities. They'd been waiting at this point for, this was now 2008, they'd been waiting since the early 90s for their flats to be fixed, or to be rebuilt, for them to be rehoused. And so there was a huge outcry in the community, and that outcry then led to a lot of very positive community activism, and in which the community kind of were trying to seek a way in which their right to housing could be connected to human rights, and could be connected to the idea that they had a right to a community-based regeneration. And so one of the groups that was formed was called Rialto Rights and Action Group. And through lobbying politicians and through a lot of work, they were successful in getting these regeneration projects restarted in 2012. And then they were successful at getting community benefit clauses included in these contracts. And that was considered at the time to be a massive positive action. However, those projects are still ongoing. The difficulty is that there wasn't buy-in from Dublin City Council. Even though the clauses were included, the clauses have suffered massively because of that lack of buy-in. I'm going to move on to the New Children's Hospital. The New Children's Hospital, 2012, it was decided that it was going to be built right beside St. Teresa's Garden and Dolphin's Barn, again, an area of the same area. And these community groups had already learned so much from their previous work. They realized, okay, there's this big opportunity here. We can lobby the stakeholders within this project to see if we can get opportunities for the local community. And the stakeholders in this project were very receptive, and there was a lot of positive steps that were taken. There was a research trip took place to go to Queen's Elizabeth University in Glasgow, in which community benefit clauses have been included. They were successful at hiring a community benefit champion right at the start of the process. They did a study. They got Richard McFarlane, who was an expert in creating these community benefit clauses. He did it for Scotland, and he created the clause. And so those clauses, again, the Children's Hospital is still being built. It is still ongoing, but not that there hasn't been difficulty, but it has been running very smoothly. The clause itself has been very flexible to the needs of the community. There's been many processes built into the clause in which it makes it that there has been very successful at the reporting, at monitoring, and at feedback. And so that's been seen so far as being a success. And finally, now we're into the final project, which is the National Development Finance Agency. And this is the project in which the Irish government decided that they were going to have a pilot. And they decided that the best way for them to have a pilot was to do it through the National Development Finance Agency. And this is the statutory financial advisor to the state. And they're also the Procurement and Delivery Authority for PPP projects in Ireland. And they were told, you know, put in a clause and see how it goes. And there was no policy linked to that. It was just a case of they were the NTMA were asked to do this, and the individuals within the department that were given this responsibility, they actually really liked the idea of doing this. It was kind of like what you said, Roberta, before about these people, children, and they liked this. They were positive about the idea of doing this. And so they ran with it, and the project, the clause they used the learnings from the Children's Hospital. They used the same. They connected with them. They used the same clause. They used the same processes, and so the clause has ran very smoothly. Some of the difficulty that they have found has to do with the fact of when Ireland reached full employment. We don't have full employment anymore, but if we talk from 9 months ago, the projects were reaching full employment, and there was this idea, well, aren't these just about supposedly helping people get to work? Because there wasn't a policy about actually connecting to specific communities and responding to specific needs within that community, there has been a bit of a disconnect there. So my initial findings, just very, very broadly, we can have these 3 projects, and you can see how for Dublin City Council, it was driven by community activism, but the social clauses themselves had no buy-in from Dublin City Council, and so they have faced massive problems, massive barriers. For the new Children's Hospital, driven by community activism, however, it was very receptive by the internal stakeholders within the contracting authority, and so it was almost like, and also there was the policy of the new Children's Hospital. It was completely in line with the desires of the community organizers, as a hospital, this completely aligned with their own internal policy, and they have constantly responded to the idea of, yes, it is their responsibility to raise the communities, to raise community development. For the NTMA, this was the result of a government decision. The social clauses have been run in a very efficient way. The people involved have had no issues with what was asked, and they don't find it remotely onerous to do so. Their difficulty is just because they don't have policies in place that connect to why they're doing it. When there is difficulties in getting beneficiaries, they're kind of left with, well, what do we do now? So as a result of the interviews that I conducted among all the different stakeholders, I broke up the results into internal barriers, as in barriers in which that people did have control over, as opposed to outside barriers in which the people would not have control over. And these were the barriers that they found contracting authorities to be risk averse, that there was a need for training, there was no resources provided for running the social clauses, and that they were seen as low priority. The external barriers was this need for, policy framework. Connecting with outside agencies was difficulty, the issue of full employment, the issue of value for money. People felt that this was not a good use of value for money. The limitations of the clause itself, the fact that you can only do it specifically for a specific contract, that you can't be flexible around that because of the, obviously, EU law has certain limitations to what exactly one can do with a social clause. And then there's the issue of subcontractors. Bogus employment is a big issue in Ireland with subcontractors, and the idea of subcontractors being quite small and how can they take on these social contracts. The drivers, that hasn't worked out well at all there. But the drivers are again, it's about the idea of clear legal and policy. When it's clear as to what the law and the policy is, that is a positive driver. Political leadership was pointed to as being massively important. and various political activists were seen as having driven the press forward. Advocate agencies were listed as being very important, community coalitions, internal champions, the need within organizations for people to take on the role of pushing the project forward. But then at the end of the day was the idea of that there has to be an actual person employed in order to make sure all of the steps of the process happens, and that is an important thing to have resources for. So finally, so this is kind of everything boiled down. Is in Ireland we need a central government policy on sustainable procurement. This would provide political will. It would connect. It would provide the ability to connect to resources. It would provide the ability to connect to outside agencies, and would provide guidance. At the moment, we don't have any guidance at all. There's this idea of value for money versus social value. When there is an idea that, especially in the particular situation we find ourselves in now, there is this idea of like, what should these things be valued in terms of money? There is an idea that what we call value for money, we have to reframe it and really question, what is it that we as a people value? So what is it that our government values? And these, as you said, Roberto, this is beyond money. It's not necessarily about money. And then we always get back to this idea of the need for training. It's at all the different levels. There is a huge need for training in an area in which there is such potential, to change processes on a social and environmental level. So that's me done. Thank you very much. Again, I learned an awful lot from the presentations. So yeah, thanks a million. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you a lot for your presentation. Just one thing, I will say that public participation is something new and clearly important, also under SDG 16. Public procurement used to be very technical. It is still very technical, but obviously affect the people, and the people want to be involved. And I think that these examples are very interesting from this point of view. Is there any urgent question from anyone? Okay, so we will keep Leila. We will keep all the question, and I will go to the next. Thank you again, Deirdre. To the next speaker, Dirk Bronselaer. I might have mispronounced it. Is a consultant with a number of decades of experience working with donors on the ground, this time in Africa, and we very much look forward in hearing your presentation. Please, you have the floor, Dirk.
Okay, thank you very much, Roberto. I enjoyed all these presentations so much. I'm trying to find the way to share my presentation. No. So maybe so this is not the right way, apparently. Is it, or do you see my presentation? No. Let me go back to Leila gives me some advice here. Not really. So can anybody help me here? So how I can share? I see I can share.
Do you have the chat, Dirk?
I have the chat, yes.
So at the bottom of the chat, there is a square with an arrow.
Yes. Click
on that.
Yeah, I've clicked on it. Then I see my presentation.
And
now I have to click on share now. Aha.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So do you see? Do I? Oh.
Yes,
so do you
it is
see
coming.
my
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So here I am. So thank you very much for having me. I'm so excited to be among all these interesting people. Let me say something about myself first, quickly. I'm not from an academic background, so I'm a practitioner. So my name is Dirk Bronselaer. I'm an architect by training. And as a young boy, 30 years ago, I left Europe and went to work in Africa, where I was inspired in Zimbabwe by the great Mick Pierce to develop green architecture and sustainable construction. So then about 20 years ago, so I had the opportunity to work with multiple development institutions and United Nations, but always in Africa. And so I encountered procurement and very quickly encountered public procurement reform as a vehicle to drive sustainability. And so recently I compiled all my experience into a methodology, what I call procurement reform laboratories. Okay, so well, Roberto talked about it a bit, yeah. So the scope of public procurement, he focused on Europe, but if you look at the world, the scope is that the GDP, world GDP is about more or less about 80 trillion, which is 80,000 billion US dollars, of which varying from the source, how much is spent on public procurement, but it's between, like I see Mexico is like 5%, but in developing countries it goes up easily to 20%. So 10 trillion is about the budget every year spent on public procurement. And then the World Bank has started, and I'm afraid they stopped doing this, benchmarking public procurement performance across the world. And the latest report is 2017, where they assess performance ranging between 50 to 75%. So, which means that there may be 2.5 to 5 trillion worldwide at risk. So improving performance from 50 to 75 to 100%, that would secure maybe a lot of money. Anyway, how much it is, I don't know, but it's a huge amount of money that is there that is at risk. And if you compare it to the ODA, if the target is that it's 1.7% of GDP worldwide, that would be 500 billion US dollar every year spent on development, which is a target that we've never reached because we're around 150 billion every year. So we're far away from our target, and we're far away from the budget that we could generate by doing better procurement. So procurement reform is okay. I can click here. Yeah, procurement reform can do. Yeah, so procurement reform can do a lot of good. So traditionally, so as you understand, my work is in Africa and for the last 30 years in development as well. So I worked in developing countries, and procurement reform is high on the agenda in a number of multi-development banks, multilateral development banks. But traditionally, it's within the project scope, which is, oh, that flopped. No, go back. So it's, sorry, I'm getting used to this technology. So it's within the project scope. So with a start, with an end, and in the meanwhile, you keep yourself busy with doing project-related activities, which I think may be insufficient. It's often a sector scope, and as you may know, infrastructure is a very popular sector in Africa, which is just also very narrow. Procurement is regarded as a transaction between two parties, that are generally adversaries with two different interests. One, the public sector wants to deliver public service while the private sector wants to make a profit. So my point is that we would have to get away from transaction scope. Procurement has a tendency to retain value, and even if you go into green and sustainable procurement, sustain environment and keep societies in place, which is a very conservative attitude and does not improve anything. So on capacity development, which is high on the agenda as well in the development dialogue, capacity tends to be looked at that you need to fill the gaps. So as if you can walk around with a bucket of capacity and pour it in the holes where the capacity is missing. Once you fill the holes, you go home, you've done your job, and capacity is built. Far from the reality, actually. A key issue with what I've encountered in reform is that it's looking at government, and government is the only owner of public procurement. I'm so happy that I've seen testimonies of different approaches, and community benefits appears to be high on the agenda now in Ireland and in Wales, for instance. So that makes me quite happy. And sovereign systems also jeopardize public procurement reform because sometimes countries, definitely in Africa, do not have the resources and the capacity and the leverage to move forward on reform, and they may need to rely on resources across the borders. More about that. And then one last note is on what is called the country procurement assessment reports. Most of us are familiar with it, and the maps, the methodology to assess procurement systems developed by OECD and the World Bank. There's new maps has been developed in new maps with a sustainable procurement subdivision that is not fully developed as far as I know, but that may have arrived in the meanwhile, comme le nouveau Beaujolais. But the point of the assessments is that it's the driver for reform, but it's usually the only stepping stone, and it brings a bad news report, and every year they renew the bad news report, leaving the mess with the governments to resolve the issues. So, so this is not what I'm really favoring. Oh, this is not doing what it. Okay, I'll try to explain what is not really visible. So instead of project scope, so procurement reform laboratories, what I'm talking about, introduces a cycle approach. So you engage into something and you don't stop. You keep learning and you keep engaging and you keep developing. Sector scope is never in the picture, so we look at integrated approach and all sectors are involved. From a transaction scope between two adversary parties, we propose procurement to be a development vehicle. So that means that you bring parties closer to one another, not far away as enemies, but you bring them together. And the risk here that often is raised is that, oh my God, if you bring those parties closer together, there is a risk of fraud and corruption. And that's true. If you bring them close together within four walls, one-on-one, there's a high risk. But if you do not do that, if you have enough participants and a critical mass of stakeholders looking and participating, it's even a protection against fraud and corruption. So, and instead of retaining value and environment and society, so we propose to add value and to better the environment and improve and connect societies. So this, it's also a bit of a paradigm problem with sustainability because it wants to keep what we have while we know that what we have is not good enough. So we must move forward. We must be progressive and disruptive and improve and better whatever we do. So sustainability has, in my view, a paradigm problem. So, and instead of capacity gap filling, running around with buckets of capacity, so we propose professionalization, not only adding capacity, but do training and mentoring and career development. So give people certificates, diplomas that they can enter and develop a career and stay in the procurement profession. And so the national professionalization system is required that involves public, private, and civil society. I'll talk more a bit about that. Not sending people from abroad to do some capacity building left and right, piecemeal way, and then run off. And the narrow government ownership is really jeopardizing reform. And so I've noticed in other speakers, what we need is a broad country ownership. We need a critical mass of diverse stakeholders with at least public, private sectors and civil society communities engaging. And the last, almost invisible, is sovereign integration. So many countries don't have the resources, don't have training institutions. So looking across the borders and try to interface within countries, peer reviews, peer assistance, peer support, interfacing among the different stakeholders horizontally can be very beneficial. Okay, so procurement reform laboratories has three main dimensions. Is that it wants to spread widely, and it wants to go deeply, and it wants to run over a longer time. So the first one to spread widely is that as every contract is between a public sector party and a private sector party to the benefit of the community, the governmental market and civil society, they are equal owners and partners in the public procurement industry. So that's a bit of a paradigm shift, and that makes a completely different approach to public procurement. So that's one dimension that is wider. Professionalization needs to be wider because you work with local training institutes, with chambers of commerce, non-governmental organizations, professional associations, and public service authorities. I'm missing so many in these because you have a variety of each and every one of those has a variety of stakeholders that can participate at central, decentralized levels, and so on. And you have to work across borders, and you have to look at regional integration opportunities. So many e-procurement departments and units in Africa are struggling enormously, while in the neighboring country they may perform very, very well, and they may bring about change and learning to other parties. So this is definitely an opportunity to explore. Laboratories want to root procurement deeply by the professionalization, as I mentioned before, and this professionalization needs to be delivered needs to be institutionalized in local training institutes. I mentioned them above. There's so many that are ready and eager to participate in this training. And it has to be delivered to in the public sector, to supervisors, decision makers, as well as practitioners, but also technicians. You may be able to deliver some short-term skills training to technicians that may help procurement performance forward. So you need those different levels and then related certificates and degrees, so to keep them in the public sector procurement profession. And it has also to be delivered to the private sector participants, because bidders do not have the ability or the capacity to prepare a public procurement bid. They don't know how to manage risk. They don't know how to approach banks for securities. They don't know how to follow up. They don't know how to manage a public sector contract. So this is then mostly directed to small and medium enterprises. And you have to deliver to civil society partners as well. Social accountability practices, which was launched a long time ago within the World Bank environment, and has been taken up by the social accountability entities that are at arm's length of the World Bank. But it still exists, but it's still very low key. But there's a lot of work to be done there. So to bring all of these together and to bring a sustainable and long-term perspective. So the time cycle, so you have to look at cycles in the longer term. So, and you not only have to follow change, because once you engage in laboratories with all these stakeholders I've mentioned, you enter into a continuous cycle of learning, and you learn from them, and eventually they will start learning among themselves, and they will develop their expertise. And you have to drive change. You have to pick up on good ideas. It's very difficult actually to pick up good ideas and not to leave them behind, but to keep them alive. And if they do not fertilize today, they may fertilize next year, and then they may be very fruitful. So keep your data and your repository. So these are the three dimensions of procurement laboratories. Well, I'm sure some of you think that it now becomes very complex. It's wide, it's deep, it's long term. So where does it end? And it is complex. But I keep saying that sustainability requires complexity. If it's too simple, it's usually not very sustainable. So we may discuss that maybe later. It's maybe a bit provocative. But it's far from complicated. So it is complex, I admit, but it's far from complicated because you have a very wide playing field. But if people emerge and you work with those that emerge. And so your cycle always is that you have to launch your ideas in a large workshop with your stakeholders, but then you have to engage on one-on-one with the champions that you encounter in the workshop, and you take this forward to the next consolidation workshop, and then you bring them all together and you invite them to share all their ideas and issues and whatever they have to share. So the activities are primarily a cycle of stakeholder mapping. So you get key stakeholders together to start with. You do an issues and needs assessment, which is the bad news report. After that, you do your strategy development. Where do you want to go from here? And then you do a joint action plan to indicate that who wants to do what. And then you roll out this in cycles and feedback loops. So a bit more about those activities. Stakeholder mapping, I think, is pretty straightforward. You have to identify, analyze them. You have to get them from diverse sectors, diverse interests, geography. Think about spreading across the country. You have to have two small ones, big ones, or you have to mix all of those. And you have to be flexible, including emergent stakeholders along the way. And your result is a stakeholder map. And if possible, it's a visual map along those criteria where you visualize the patterns, where you see the strengths and weaknesses geographically, sectorally, or whatever. So that in a visual map, you can easily see, disclose, find patterns that gives you very good clues how to move forward. So the next is the second step is you do your bad news report, which is your assessment. I mentioned the maps already, but there are other tools like the African Development Bank has the bank country procurement assessment. UNOPS has the rapid procurement assessment. The EU has the Pillar 5 assessment. All of these are assessments that can be very useful. But as you see, these are one piece in the puzzle for reform. They're just enough to drive reform forward. So, and you have to know that you can't capture everything at once, but don't worry, you have a review cycle, so the new things can emerge and you can pick them up and work with them. You have to come to a common understanding of the situation, issues and needs. You don't have to agree all of them, what is important, but you can have differences, but you can take them along and you find your champions who can work on some of those issues, and some of the champions will want to work on others. And you have to ensure engagement of stakeholders, but usually it works very quickly. You find your champions that are taking the lead in those things. And then if you have your bad news report, you invite all your stakeholders to think on the way forward, on strategy solutions, and your results is your issues repository or your issues database. Your next step is you bring the same, again, you go into your workshop, you do your one-on-ones, and then you come back in the consolidation workshop, and you generate a good news report, and you will have a common understanding and agreement on key strategic interventions, what to do. And then you invite all stakeholders, and this is a difficult one, what they want to do themselves to move this agenda forward. And your result here is a strategy or a strategy repository or paper. Then the action plan. Yes.
Sorry, Dirk, can you just speed up a bit to the conclusion?
Yes, okay. So yeah, I'm almost there. Yes. So in the action plan, it's very important to cover the cycle of results, not only inputs and outputs and results. Important is that you have to diversify leadership, which is often a government institution. Ownership can be across all the stakeholders. Resources you have to discuss and result in an action plan. I'm going to speed up as Roberto asked me. The implementation of the action plan is it's a cycle, repetitive workshops and learning and moving forward. So the result is all of the above. And my conclusion is that this is a model based on my experiences in the field, definitely only in Africa, in a variety of countries. I mentioned that before. You have to be cautious that, and everybody will have encountered this, that you will find a cold welcome from some of the stakeholders, primarily government, because they have to yield responsibilities. But you will find easily and quickly champions from other sectors that take the lead and will show how this can be moved forward. And so you have to build ownership and synergies. They will come across the stakeholders that will change and evolve over time. And what you want is to spread it widely, you want it to grow deeply and to gain momentum over time. This was my conclusion, and so that's my last slide. So I'm sorry I was a bit longer than anticipated, but still, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for this presentation that stresses again the need for involving all stakeholders. Is there any urgent question? Otherwise, I would rather give the floor to our last presenter and keep something like 10 minutes at the end for questions. No questions? Brilliant. So please, Dagne Sabockis, she's a PhD in Sweden, Stockholm, and she's a lawyer, and meaning that she's focusing on the specific aspects of a specific jurisdiction, but not a small one, because this is EU law. So we did Latin America, Africa, and we are back to Europe. Dagne, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you see me? It seems so. Great.
Yes.
So thank you very much for having me at this wonderful conference, and it is indeed inspiring for me to hear all these different approaches from around the world. Now, before I begin, I know that I am the last obstacle between you and the lunch, a bit depending on your time zone, of course. So I will try to be concise, but bear with me. These are quite broad questions that I'm looking to. So we'll see how we can manage to cover them in the best way possible. And now it's my turn to learn the collaborate idea, how to share my screen. Let's see, share files, perhaps. I'm so sorry, I'm so used to Zoom now, but you learn something new every day. Share screen, there we go. And now it seems that the presentation is on and I cannot see you anymore. Could someone perhaps speak out if this is visible?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So without further ado, this is the topic that I am looking into. This is also my research topic for my PhD, actually, the issues of balance of sustainability and competition in the scope of the EU Directive of Procurement. It's very interesting to note this first big notion, big provision included by the EU legislator in the directive, which states, as has already been pointed out actually by Professor Caranta, that procurement is viewed as a key market-based instrument to be used to achieve smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. And this is really large, because for a long time we were asking ourselves, is procurement, can we use that to be more green, more sustainable? And yes, this is as high as it gets, a very clear encouragement from the EU legislator. But at the same time, we see that completely free leeway is not given to sustainability considerations. The EU legislator is also emphasizing that the efficiency in the use of public funds must be ensured. And this is the starting point for my research. And this, what I like to call a dual development of the law, this sort of idea of the balance, the right balance between the two ideas, is actually visible throughout the entire directive. But I would like to focus on the two perhaps largest provisions out there. So Directive 2014, the current public procurement directive in the EU, introduced two new principles. And this is quite interesting. So I call them the principle of sustainability and the principle of competition. We don't actually know if it's two new principles or three new principles. On the left-hand side, you see the column of principles of equal treatment, non-discrimination, etc. These principles have been around for quite some time. We all know them, and there's not a lot of debate about what these principles actually mean. It is completely different with the new principles that have been included in the directive. And nevertheless, it is really notable that we now have a principle of sustainability in the directive. Now, of course, it is my own name, the principle of sustainability, as I call it. The actual wording of the directive is a little bit more lengthy, more precise as well. So it states that member states in the EU shall take appropriate measures to ensure that in the performance of public contracts, economic officers comply with applicable obligations in the fields of environmental, social, and labor law. This is a principal provision, meaning that the whole directive is essentially to be interpreted in the light of this provision. At least that's how principles generally work in procurement context. However, it is new and it is not completely clear what we are going to be doing with this principle, because it targets the member states, contrary to the other more well-known principles of procurement. There's also some issue since it actually points out only the performance of contracts as the area where we need to ensure that compliance with inter alia environmental obligations exists. And here's a little note: green public procurement is just a note for you, dear audience. I am focusing on the green aspect of sustainability. It's so broad, but to be able to draw somewhat concise conclusions, my focus is green, so GPP. Okay, so this is the sustainability aspect. On the other side, we have the so-called principle of competition, also a new principle in the directive, which states that the design and procurement cannot be made with the intention of artificially narrowing down competition. Also, a new principle, quite exciting. We don't really know what it means. We can see in the directive that the EU legislator has clarified it somehow by stating that, well, competition shall be considered to be artificially narrowed where the design is made with the intention of unduly favoring or disadvantaging certain economic operators. Once again, a little bit difficult to know how we are going to work with this principle. Now, keep in mind, the other principles are so short and clear. The principle of proportionality, for example, principle of transparency. Here we have the element of intent. It has been pointed out by several scholars that it's very difficult to work with the element of intent when we're speaking about decisions of contracting of things. And then again, unduly favoring or disadvantaging economic operators. What does that actually mean? Well, we don't actually know. There's quite some legal uncertainty. However, there is some opening in the case law of the CJEU. We have one case where the Court of Justice of the European Union has actually been able to interpret the principle of sustainability. It's a very recent case, adjudicated this year, and the short background of the case is that we had an economic operator, Tim, who was excluded from the whole public procurement procedure because it was found that one of its subcontractors was not in compliance with standards relating to the right to work for people with disabilities. And Tim was not happy about this. Tim challenged the decision of the contracting authority in front of Italian courts. Essentially, this became a question for the CJEU to deal with. The question posed to the Court of Justice of the European Union related primarily Article 57, which deals with exclusion grounds. It basically says that member states or contracting authorities can exclude tenders where it is found that a violation of the obligations referred to in Article 18.2 exists. And this is how the CJEU started looking into this very specific Article 18.2, or as I call it, the principle of sustainability. And we can note a sort of a crescendo way of explaining what this principle is all about by the CJEU. So the court stated that, well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that Article 18 is a general provision and it is entitled the Principles of Procurement. So given that, the court continued by providing in that article that economic operators must comply with obligations related to inter alia environmental law. The EU legislator sought to establish that requirement as a principle, like the other principles referred to in that article. And hence, the court continued, in the general scheme of the directive, this requirement constitutes a cardinal value with which the member states must ensure compliance. Really big words from the Court of Justice, perhaps not so strange actually, given that indeed this is how the EU legislator structured the rules, structured the directive. So despite the issues related to the drafting of the provision and unclarity of the provision as such, the Court of Justice seemed to recognize that, no, well, this is a cardinal value in procurement. And of course, for GPP, for sustainability in procurement context, this is quite. And now I would like to use this case to look into these two new principles of procurement by working with a matrix. And the matrix that I've structured here is based on the two functions that we normally see in principles of procurement. On the one hand, we are speaking about principles as benchmarks for interpretation of the more detailed rules of the directive. And on the other hand, principles of procurement are also normally functioning as any other rule of the directive, in the sense that they can be enforced through the remedies directive. Put shortly, if an economic operator considers that a decision of a contracting authority is against a rule of the directive, for example, a principle, that decision can be challenged in front of a review body and remedied. So then applying this matrix on the two new principles, we end up with quite an interesting finding. And voila. So looking at the first leg of principles in procurement, so the interpretation leg, we see that indeed both of these principles seem to be able to function as the overarching interpretative framework in which we interpret the other rules of the directive. And we have the Court of Justice confirming this in the case Tim. So yes, indeed. Now I should add, with the rule of competition, that was not the provision in focus for the Court of Justice in case Tim. However, it did refer to this provision as well. So the question was actually posed in the legal doctrine, whether these principles are even principles at all. They seem to be principles. It is more problematic looking into the second leg of the function of principles, namely the enforceability aspect. It it is the principle of sustainability, which appears to be somewhat of a limp principle in that the way it is drafted by the EU legislator leaves not that much room for it to be able to be enforced through the Remedies Directive. Essentially, it is a statement which requires member states to ensure that companies, economic operators, comply with law, environmental law. Whereas the principle of competition is a little bit more like the other principles that we know, in that it places an obligation on contracting authorities directly, and it is all about the design of procurements. And of course, this is still preliminary because we only have one case so far that looks into the new Article 18 to this extent. So we will see how the case law will develop, but this is what we're right now. And so my issue is actually the legal uncertainty. Being the lawyer that I am, perhaps also given my Swedish background and the way law works here, I am quite bothered by the continuous conclusions in the legal doctrine that, we know that GPP is permitted, and that's great, but we've been asking ourselves how for around 2 decades. And it's true, Directive 2014-24, so the current directive on procurement, has indeed clarified some issues such as eco-labeling, life cycle costing. Those are great steps forward with respect to sustainable procurement. But these new principles that we now have to work with, in particular contracting authorities have to work with, this morphs the legal uncertainty somewhat. So unfortunately, we still have so many questions and big questions, but not many answers yet. Of course, I don't think I need to explain the issues connected to legal uncertainty. If we do not know what the law is, if a contracting authority is not sure about what the law is, there may be a slight reluctance from its side to engage in GPP in the first place. At least looking in Sweden, it was actually extremely interesting to hear about the experience in Wales, the lack of cases. Sweden is probably on the other side of the spectrum. We have approximately 1,500 cases in Sweden only that are related to procurement every year. So of course, this compromises in the end the real societal needs. And if you cannot be sure that your procurement is going to go through, are you gonna take that extra step and try to make it sustainable, adding maybe additional legal uncertainty? It's not a great development of the law. More certainty would indeed be appreciated. But I don't really like these tales that end sort of on a sad note, and this is what also inspires my research. I suggest that we could also, in addition to all the great legal research that is going on with relation to the more detailed aspects of procurement directive, we could also look at the issue of balance from a broader perspective. And now, what do I mean by it? It's actually not super revolutionary. I suggest that it would make sense for us to look into primarily EU law. So following the well-established methodology of European law, where we, where we lack more clarifications by the EU legislator. And while the case law is not in abundance either, we still actually have certain legal instruments that we could look into to see whether there's, some guidance that can be extracted from there. And I say this on the basis of the requirement of consistency in the law. Both the treaty and the Court of Justice have stated that consistency and uniformity in EU law it's a very important value. It's a requirement, I should add. And on this, I then suggest that perhaps it would also make sense to make this a broader analysis by looking into the way Article 11 has been integrated into free movement and competition. Article 11, I should add, is the article declaring that environmental protection must be included in all the policies and activities of the EU. So we already have some, legal material to work with when we're looking into how the CJEU is likely to interpret the balance, how the CJEU is likely to view environmental considerations in the perspective of the market. And of course, one must be cautious. It cannot be expected that such an approach would provide that much clarity. But I believe that it would give us a general framework which would help us understand what is currently, where the current equilibrium, perhaps I should say, lies. I know that in the interest of time, I better move on to my conclusions. So just to quickly summarize some main takeaways of mine. Number one, we have a principle of sustainability. We know it is a cardinal value now, but it also appears to be a limp principle. And generally, these two new principles do not add much clarity to the law. While they do encourage sustainable procurement, at least compliance with environmental law in the performance of contracts, we don't really know what the contracting authorities or economic operators should expect from these new principles. And again, ending on a more happy note, not all hope is lost, I argue. Certain guidance may be extracted from primary EU law. And that's something I intend to do in my dissertation. Wish me luck. And of course, thank you so much for your attention.
I think we might have lost Roberto once again, no? Roberto, are you with us? Okay. By the time Roberto joins us back, do we have any questions, any pending questions? I would have one from my side for Dagne straight away. So when we have the case law and we have the principles that need to be applied, which further complicates the issue of sustainable public procurement because it's already so saturated with European and national rules, could that issue be fixed just by starting to connect these principles to the fact that we have international obligations as European Union as to the achievement of climate goals? We do have international obligations in terms of mitigating the environmental damage too. So could that be used by the court to say, okay, we need to interpret it in a different manner because EU as an entity is not independent by itself. So I would like to hear a comment maybe on that. If you can tell me a bit about it.
Thank you so much, Lela, for this comment. And I would like to say that it is so much the point of what I am currently thinking myself. I've given this topic some thought during the past years of reading, mostly researching this area, and I believe that this is crucial that the EU has entered agreements, international law agreements, where the EU has well, for example, the Paris Agreement, right? EU has, this is something that we are gonna be bound by, and when you look at the case law of the Court of Justice, similar case law, we have a case called Preuss and Electra. We could discuss it further, but in that case, we actually have the Court of Justice looking precisely at the agreements in the environmental area and stating, you know what, the EU has bound itself by these agreements, and therefore we cannot just let them go and be blind to them. But because of that, the CJEU was then more inclined to actually take a more environmental, more green finding in its in that ruling, Preuss and Electra. So absolutely, and I'd like to add that I think that this is very much in line as well with the consistency requirement, as the CJEU is not, it's up for a difficult task, as you noted, national law, EU law, environmental, international law. It's not an easy task, but interesting to see that the CJEU appears to be willing to take these considerations into account as well.
Do we have any other outstanding questions right now for any of the participants in this particular panel? If not, then Roberto, I relieve you of your duty. Thank you very much for taking over and sharing.
Just let me thank all the speakers and those asking questions. And the interesting thing I just found out is that you can't use, let's say, those words that you would not want your kids to use. I wrote bloody and I got 6 asterisks. That's interesting in the chat.
It's censoring
But
you,
what
so
I meant
yeah.
was bloody tech. Sorry, Dagne, for this. Thank you again, Leila.
Thank you,
You have the
everyone.
floor.
So thank you very much. So now we will be taking the well-deserved lunch break, and we will be rejoining in the last session at 3. So the last session is going to be on empirical evidence, and then we're going to try to wrap up the discussion with some brief comments right before, a bit before 5, to sum up what we figured out today and where the new research questions are. So have a nice lunch break, and catch you back in 45 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.